Hi, I'm Patrick, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I made a new cushion for my rattan swivel chair. Now, if you have an old Papasan chair cushion, or really any kind of cushion with buttons on it that you're trying to replace, all the same techniques will apply. Let's get started. You will need 2 yards of fabric, about 10 pounds of loose stuffing, a sewing machine, fabric shears, a sharp knife, strong thread, and staples or fabric pins. You'll also need a 10-inch tufting needle and tufting twine, and however many buttons your cushion requires. If you have your old cushion, the simplest thing to do is to take it apart so you can use the existing fabric as a template and trace it directly onto your new fabric. Start by cutting the buttons loose with a sharp knife. If you'll be reusing them, be careful not to lose any. Cut the seam to create an opening that's large enough for you to dump out the fabric. If your stuffing is still in good shape, you can reuse it. Mine was super old though, so I wanted to replace it. It filled up 2 big garbage bags and made a huge mess. It was also super staticky and stuck to everything. This was definitely my least favorite part of the whole project. Vacuuming it up was a pain because it kept clogging my filter, but eventually I got the hang of it. I just had to go slow and make sure I wasn't sucking up too much of the foam at once. After I emptied out the cushion, I flipped it inside out, cleaned it off, and finished cutting the rest of the seam. It was way easier and faster for me to just do this on the floor so I could hold one half of the fabric down with my foot while lifting the other half and cutting the seam. With the old cushion emptied and the 2 halves separated, I picked the half that was in the best shape to use as my template and ironed around the edge to flatten the seam. I laid out my new fabric on the floor and placed a few long, flat objects on top to help hold it in place while I traced my template with a Sharpie. I was relieved that my fabric was just wide enough for me to get my 2 halves laid out in the orientation I wanted. If they didn't fit this way, I would have had to flip them 45 degrees, which I had plenty of room for, but I really wanted the stripes in the fabric to run vertically up the cushion, so I was glad it worked out. After cutting out my first piece, I laid it on top of my second piece just to double check that my pattern would line up, and I'm glad I did because I ended up having to retrace it about 6 inches higher and half an inch to the right in order to get the stripes to line up exactly. This is the first big reason why I was happy to be doing this project myself instead of taking it to a shop. I don't know if a shop would have thought to pay attention to a small detail like this, especially because it's a pretty subtle pattern. I took my time getting the pieces lined up as best I could, then made my final tracing cut. We'll see how it turned out in the end. I stacked my 2 pieces to prepare for sewing, making absolutely sure that I remembered that I'd be flipping this inside out, so I needed to keep the piece with the Sharpie line on the outside of the sack. I don't have many fabric pins, so I just stapled my 2 pieces together. I actually really liked how accurately and securely this held everything in place, even if it meant adding the extra step of having to remove them all later. I made sure to leave a section open to flip and stuff the cushion, and then I was ready to set up my sewing machine. An issue that I've encountered when buying these heavy-duty threads is that they often come on these really big spools which don't fit on your machine. So my solution to that was to just make a spool holder out of a couple dowels, one that's just a little bit narrower than the diameter of your spool, with a skinnier dowel drilled through it just to act as a stop, which I clamp into a heavy vise on top of my bench, and it works just fine. My sewing table is pretty small, so I made a temporary add-on with a square of MDF to help support the fabric. I put masking tape around the edge to prevent snagging, and after putting some tape markers where I wanted to leave an opening in the sack, I was ready to sew. This part was fun, and it finally felt like I was getting somewhere. To help keep my seam a consistent distance from the edge of the fabric, I placed a strip of masking tape half an inch to the right of my needle. As I was sewing, I just made sure my fabric went right up to the edge of the tape, and it made it pretty easy to sew a nice even seam. When I was done sewing, I pulled out all the staples. I used a flat-headed screwdriver to help, and once I got a technique down, it went pretty quick. Then I switched to a zigzag stitch and sewed a 1/4 inch from the edge of my fabric to help prevent it from fraying. With all the sewing done, it was time to flip the sack inside out, and I was really happy with how well the pattern lined up. The next step was to mark out where I was going to sew my buttons for tufting. I punched out a few masking tape dots to use as temporary markers that I could adjust if necessary. I laid the template on top of my sack and pulled the fabric down to the first row of holes. I marked the hole locations with the masking tape dots and repeated this for the entire side. I used the pattern of the stripes as a reference grid and made some small adjustments to my dots to make sure the spacing was consistent and symmetrical. Then I removed the tape and made a small dot with a Sharpie. I used a pin to poke through the dots and made a mark where it came out on the other side, again using the pattern in the fabric as my final guide. I stapled the seam around the opening in the sack, ironed it flat, and was ready to stuff my cushion. First I crammed all the old foam into a single garbage bag so I could weigh it. I figured it would be helpful to know as a general guide for how much of the new stuffing to use. It weighed 2,944 grams, or 6.5 pounds. I opened up the 10-pound bag of polyester stuffing I had ordered and filled up 2 garbage bags until I had 6.5 pounds. Much to my relief, it was way less messy to deal with than the old foam that was in the original cushion. The looser strands helped hold it all together and it wasn't staticky at all. This made the stuffing process pretty painless. Although not entirely painless because I kept scratching my arm on the staples around the opening of the sack. I eventually wised up and put on my long-sleeved work shirt. I used some small clamps to temporarily keep the opening shut, and then I tested it out in the chair. It was actually pretty shocking to feel the difference compared to the old cushion. It really felt like a whole new chair. I knew the stuffing would eventually get compressed, and the tufting would also make it a lot thinner, so I definitely wanted to err on the fuller side. I ended up adding an extra 500 grams of stuffing, and it was feeling really good. This was reason number 2 that I was happy to be doing this myself. If I had taken it to a shop, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to test the cushion at this stage and dial in the exact amount of stuffing I wanted. Once I was happy with how it was feeling, I took a moment to get the stuffing as evenly distributed as I could, and then it was time to sew the opening shut. I pulled out the staples and began sewing a ladder stitch, which hides the stitches when you're finished. It was super satisfying to see the hole get smaller and smaller until it was completely shut. The cushion looked like a beached beluga whale at this point, and it was one of those trust the process moments where things look worse before they look better. Now it was time for the step that I had been dreading the most out of this whole project, covering my buttons with fabric. I ordered a cheap button covering kit off of Amazon, but as I suspected, my fabric was way too thick for me to snap the 2 button halves together by hand. When I tried to press them together in my vise, it actually kind of worked, but I completely crushed the wimpy plastic part that presses the 2 halves together. I ended up making it work by swapping out the yellow plastic presser with a metal socket head that was the same diameter, and I developed a technique that, although kind of finicky, allowed me to use the kit without hand sewing my fabric onto 26 buttons. The method I arrived at consisted of cutting out an oversized circle and soaking it in water. I found that wetting the fabric helped hold everything in place and reduced fraying. Then I laid the fabric over the plastic holder, pressed the button shell into the holder, trimmed off the excess fabric, rolled the edges down, placed the second half of the button on top, and used the socket head in my vise to press it all together. By the last few buttons, I felt like I was finally getting the hang of it. A professional upholstery shop would have a heavy-duty button press that would make this step a breeze, but I've got to say that it felt extra satisfying to overcome this hurdle using the tools that I had on hand, and I was really pleased with how these turned out. It did result in flattening the buttons, but I don't mind at all. I made a few extras just in case, and I was glad I did, as you'll see later. With my buttons covered, it was time for the final step, tufting. This was undoubtedly the most satisfying and enjoyable part of the whole process, and had the best combination of relatively low effort with maximum reward. I gave my pillow one last smooth and got to work. I set up my laptop beside me and followed a YouTube tufting tutorial, which I'll link below. This part went smoothly, and I was excited to be so close to the end. I did end up having to replace one button because the top popped off, and I was a little terrified that more would follow, but I gave them all a pretty firm tug, and they seemed secure. After setting the tension as equally as I could across the whole cushion, I tied them off and trimmed the ends. As a final detail, I made sure all the buttons were oriented to match the pattern of the fabric, and just like that, I was done. I'm really pleased with how this project turned out. This chair is from my childhood home, so I have a nostalgic attachment to it, and I'm happy that I was able to give it a new lease on life without paying a fortune to have it professionally done. To be honest, I don't think it could have turned out any better, and I gained some useful new skills and tools by doing this myself. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you in the next one.